What would you do if the world had written you off? If, with your last $2, you bought the one thing even more forgotten than you were, a collapsed cabin no one had seen in 20 years? That's the choice a young woman named Harriet Lowe faced in the hard country of 1880s Idaho when she traded everything she had for a pile of rotten logs and a deed to nowhere. But the truth waiting for her under a loose hearthstone wasn't just a map, but a challenge left behind by a ghost, a trail of secrets that would lead her deeper into the mountains and toward a discovery that would rewrite the very lines on the map of her world. Settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we tell the story of the trapper's last survey. Harriet Lowe arrived in the raw little town of Ketchum with the dust of the road ground into the hem of her only good dress and the silence of dismissal ringing in her ears. She was 21, but the last 6 months serving in the house of a Boise timber baron had aged her spirit. She'd been let go over a broken porcelain pitcher, a thing she hadn't even touched. But the lady of the house needed someone to blame, and a quiet orphan girl with no one to speak for her was the easiest target. The injustice of it was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She'd been given her final wages, a paltry $10, and told to be gone by morning. Now, standing on a plank sidewalk with her worn carpetbag in hand, she felt as insignificant as a single speck of dust in the vast, indifferent sweep of the Sawtooth Range that loomed over the town. Men on horseback clattered past, their faces leathered by sun and wind, not one of them giving her a second glance. She was invisible, a ghost long before her time. Her meager funds wouldn't last a week at the boarding house. She needed a place, any place that was hers. That's what led her to the Territorial Land Office, a small, stuffy room that smelled of stale tobacco and dry paper. A clerk with a green eye shade, Mr. Ames, looked up from his ledger, his expression weary. Before she could speak, a loud voice boomed from a corner. "Well, look what the stage coughed up." A man named Silas Croft, whom she'd already heard about in town, a speculator who bought and sold claims with a predator's glee, leaned back in his chair, thumbs hooked in his waistcoat. He appraised her with a dismissive smirk. "Lost, little lady?" Harriet ignored him, her gaze fixed on the clerk. "I'm looking to buy a piece of land," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. "Something small, something cheap." Croft laughed outright, a harsh, barking sound. "Cheap? Honey, the only thing cheap around here is talk." Mr. Ames, to his credit, gave Croft a sidelong glare before turning back to Harriet. "Not much available for a small purse, miss. Most everything's been claimed for mining or timber." He paused, tapping a long finger on a large, rolled map. "There is one thing. A trapper's plot. Up in the East Fork Basin. Has a cabin on it, or so the deed says. No one's laid eyes on it in a decade. Man who owned it, Alastair Finch, just vanished. Went into the mountains one fall and never came out. The territories repossessed it for back taxes." "How much?" Harriet asked, her heart starting a slow, heavy beat. $2, the clerk said. Croft choked on another laugh. $2 for a pile of rot and grizzly bears for neighbors. That cabin's likely nothing but a stain on the ground by now. But Harriet heard something else in the description. She heard solitude. She heard a place so forgotten that no one would bother her, a place where she could finally be left alone. "I'll take it," she said, her voice finding a sudden firmness. She opened her purse and laid $2 silver on the counter. They shone dully in the lamplight. The sound they made was the heaviest, most final sound she had ever heard. The transaction was simple, The paperwork a single sheet of brittle paper with her name written in the clerk's careful hand. Harriet Lowe, landowner. The words felt foreign, impossible. Silas Croft watched the whole affair with undisguised contempt. "You'll be back before the first snow, begging for work," he sneered as she folded the deed and placed it carefully in her bag. "That mountain eats people like you for breakfast." She met his gaze for a single, silent moment, her expression unreadable, and then turned and walked out without a word. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. With her remaining $8, she went not to the mercantile for supplies, but to the livery. There, in a back pen, stood a mule the color of a dusty mouse. He was old, one ear flopped over, and he regarded her with an expression of profound, weary skepticism. The liveryman wanted $5 for him. "He's stubborn, but he's sure-footed," the man said. "Name's Jedediah." Harriet paid the man, leaving her with just $3 for flour, salt, coffee, an axe, and a length of rope. She loaded her new companion with her few possessions. The mule, Jed, accepted the burden with a long, mournful sigh, as if to say he'd seen this kind of foolishness before and expected no good to come of it. As she led him through the main street, the town watched. Faces appeared in windows. Men paused on the saloon porch. Their whispers followed her like a cloud of flies, a chorus of pity and scorn. She was the fool girl who'd bought the ghost's cabin. What did she think she was going to do up there? How long before she starved or froze? Did she even know how to fire a gun? Harriet kept her eyes fixed on the jagged line of the peaks ahead, her jaw set. Their mockery was just another kind of weather, something to be endured. She had her deed, her mule, and a direction. It was more than she'd had yesterday. What secret was hiding in that forgotten cabin? Could one person's trash truly be another's treasure? Or was Harriet walking into a trap set by the unforgiving wilderness? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hidden history. Now, as the last buildings of Ketchum fell away behind her, the real journey was about to begin. As she made her final preparations at the edge of town, a shadow fell over her. Harriet looked up from tightening a cinch on Jed's pack. An old Shoshone woman stood there, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and deep as a forest pool. She held a small, tightly woven basket. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The town's noise seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of the wind in the pines and the soft jingle of the mule's harness. The woman's gaze wasn't pitying or scornful. It was something else, something ancient and knowing. She looked from Harriet to the mountains and back again. Then she reached out a dry, warm hand and laid it gently on Harriet's arm. The touch was startlingly intimate. "The mountains are patient," the old woman said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "They remember those who listen." That was all. She gave a slight nod, turned, and walked away as silently as she had appeared, disappearing around the corner of the blacksmith's shop. The words hung in the air, cryptic and heavy. Harriet didn't understand them, not then, but she felt their weight settle over her, a strange sort of blessing or a warning. She couldn't be sure which. The encounter, however brief, served as a counterpoint to the town's derision. Silas Croft had made one last show of it, striding out of the saloon as she passed, a whiskey glass in his hand. "A toast," he'd shouted to the men on the porch. "To the Queen of Finch's Folly. May her reign be short and her return swift." The men had laughed, a ragged, cruel sound that followed her up the trail. But the old woman's words felt more real, more lasting than their fleeting mockery. Harriet stored the phrase away, turning it over in her mind as she and Jed began the slow, arduous climb into the high country. It was a single, strange seed of hope planted in the barren soil of her departure. The trail was little more than a game track, fading in and out of existence. For 3 days they climbed, leaving the world of men and their judgments far behind. The air grew thin and sharp, smelling of pine resin and cold stone. The scale of the landscape was humbling. Great, granite-faced mountains clawed at a sky of impossible blue. Valleys opened up beneath them, vast and green and empty. Harriet felt her own smallness, but for the first time, it wasn't a source of shame. Out here, everyone was small. The silence was absolute, broken only by the cry of a hawk, the whisper of wind through lodgepole pines, and the steady, rhythmic plod of Jed's hooves on the rocky ground. The mule was proving his worth. He navigated treacherous scree slopes and narrow ledges with a placid determination that Harriet found herself trying to emulate. He was her silent companion, a steady, living presence in the overwhelming emptiness. His occasional soft snort or the flick of his one good ear was all the conversation she needed. He was, like her, a creature discarded by the world, now finding his purpose in a place no one else wanted. On the 4th day, guided by the crude map on her deed, she found it. The cabin was tucked into a small meadow, beside a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. But it was worse, so much worse, than she had allowed herself to imagine. Croft's taunts echoed in her mind. It wasn't a cabin so much as the memory of one. The roof, heavy with years of snow, had sagged in the middle like the spine of a dying animal. The single door hung from one leather hinge, gaping open to the darkness within. The log walls were gray and weathered, the chinking long since crumbled away, leaving gaps you could put a fist through. Weeds and wild raspberry canes grew thick around its foundation, trying to pull it back into the earth. Disappointment washed over her, cold and sharp as the creek water. For a dizzying moment, she felt the full, crushing weight of her foolishness. The townspeople were right. Croft was right. She had traded her last dollars for a ruin, a tomb. She tethered Jed in the meadow where the grass was good and walked slowly toward the structure. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, of damp earth and mouse nests and time itself. A pack rat had built a massive nest in one corner. The floor was littered with debris, and the stone fireplace was black and silent. It was a place of profound and utter abandonment. That night, she couldn't bring herself to sleep inside. She built a small, clean fire a dozen yards away, using deadfall from the surrounding pines. She made coffee and ate a piece of dry bread, watching the stars emerge, impossibly bright and close in the thin mountain air. Jed grazed nearby, his steady presence a small comfort. The cabin groaned and settled in the night wind, a sound like a man sighing in his sleep. Harriet sat wrapped in her blanket, listening to its mournful voice, and wondered if she had the strength to make this dead thing live again. The old woman's words came back to her. The mountains are patient. They remember those who listen. What was this place trying to tell her? The next morning, Harriet began to work. There was no grand plan, just a simple, dogged refusal to surrender. She started by evicting the pack rat, a noisy, chaotic battle involving a long stick and a great deal of shouting. Then came the sweeping. She used a pine bough to clear away years of accumulated dirt, leaves, and animal droppings. Underneath the debris, the puncheon floor was mostly solid, the split logs worn smooth by a solitary man's footsteps. Each small act of cleaning felt like an act of defiance against the decay. She dragged out the broken furniture, a three-legged stool and a collapsed cot, and set it in the sun. The labor was grueling. Her hands, softened by domestic work, were soon raw and blistered. Her back ached. But with every bucket of clean water she hauled from the creek, with every armful of debris she cleared, the cabin felt a little less like a tomb and a little more like a shelter. Her silent companion, Jed, would watch her from the meadow, his one good ear cocked in her direction, as if supervising her efforts. In the afternoons, he would amble over and stand patiently while she leaned against his warm flank, catching her breath. His quiet solidity was a balm to her frayed spirit. She spent 2 days patching the roof, using fallen bark, pine boughs, and thick squares of sod she cut from the meadow. It was clumsy work, but it would keep out the worst of the rain. She rehung the door using new leather straps cut from a piece of her own luggage. It swung shut with a satisfying thud, enclosing the space for the first time in years. The interior was still dark and rough, but it was hers. It was a room. It was a defense against the vast wilderness outside. On the 3rd day of her labor, she turned her attention to the fireplace. It was a solid, well-built structure of river stone, the heart of the little cabin. As she swept out the cold, packed ash from the hearth, her hand brushed against one of the flat stones that formed the apron in front of the firebox. It shifted slightly under her weight. She frowned, pushing at it again. It rocked, just a fraction of an inch. The others were set firm in a bed of clay and mortar. This one was different. She knelt, running her fingers around its edge. The mortar line was thinner here, a slightly different color, as if it had been applied later than the rest. It was a detail so small as to be almost invisible, an anomaly, a thing that did not fit. Most people would have ignored it, swept the dirt back over it, and forgotten. But Harriet's life had been one of noticing small details: a misplaced teacup, a speck of dust on a polished table, the subtle shift in a mistress's tone. Her survival had depended on seeing what others missed. She looked at the stone, a faint prickle of curiosity disturbing the rhythm of her exhaustion. It was just a stone, but it was a question in a room that should have held no more secrets. For now, she left it, but the thought of it stayed with her. A loose thread she knew she would eventually have to pull. The work of survival took precedence. Harriet spent the next week chinking the logs of the cabin, mixing clay from the creek bank with dry grass to create a thick, insulating plaster. She worked her way around the small structure, sealing it against the wind and the coming cold. It was messy, repetitive labor, but it was deeply satisfying. With each gap she filled, the cabin felt more whole, more sound. Her hands became tools, caked with mud. Her mind focused on the simple, honest task before her. She was not a servant here, waiting on the whims of others. She was a builder, a creator. The cabin and the valley were her only masters, and they demanded only one thing: effort. During her work, Jed was her constant shadow. He would follow her to the creek, stand patiently as she dug the clay, and doze in the sun as she pressed the mixture into the walls. She talked to him sometimes, not expecting an answer, but simply to hear a human voice break the profound silence. She told him about her life in Boise, about the broken pitcher, about the smug face of Silas Croft. The mule would listen, his long ears twitching, and occasionally nudge her with his soft nose, a gesture of simple, uncomplicated comfort. The rhythm of her days fell into a simple pattern: rise with the sun, work until her muscles screamed, eat a spare meal by the fire, and fall into an exhausted sleep. The physical toll was immense, but her spirit, so bruised and battered when she'd arrived, began to heal. The clean, cold air and the honest labor were a kind of medicine. But always, at the back of her mind, was the loose Hearthstone. Every evening, as she sat by her small fire inside the now-sealed cabin, her eyes would be drawn to it. It was a quiet puzzle, a whisper from the man who had lived here before her. What had he hidden? A few coins? A personal trinket? Or was it nothing at all? Just a poorly laid stone. One night, a week after her arrival, a cold rain began to fall. It drummed steadily on her newly patched roof, a sound that should have been comforting. But a small, persistent drip began to fall near the fireplace. It wasn't coming from the roof, but from the chimney itself. Water was finding its way down the stonework. She realized with a jolt that if water could get in, it would pool in the hollow space she suspected was beneath that stone. Whatever was under there, if anything, could be ruined. The thought spurred her to action. She took the small pry bar from her pack of tools and knelt before the hearth. The fire cast flickering shadows on the wall as she worked the tip of the bar into the thin seam of mortar. It resisted at first. She put her weight into it, her muscles straining. Then, with a soft, scraping sound, the mortar gave way. She worked her way around the stone, chipping away the seal. Finally, she slid the bar underneath and heaved. The stone, heavy and slick with soot, lifted up and tilted to the side. Beneath it was a hollow, just as she'd suspected. It was about a foot square and 6 inches deep, lined with a carefully folded piece of oilcloth to keep out the damp. And nestled inside, protected by the cloth, was a tightly rolled cylinder of scraped deerskin, tied with a leather thong. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands trembled as she reached into the dark space and lifted it out. It was light, almost weightless. She untied the thong and slowly, carefully, unrolled the hide on the floor in the firelight. It was not a letter. It was a map. The map was drawn with charcoal and some kind of berry ink, the lines stark against the pale, creamy surface of the hide. It was a work of patient artistry. It showed the valley she was in, marking her cabin with a small, careful drawing of a smoking chimney. But it also showed the terrain beyond, terrain she had never seen. It depicted landmarks with a woodsman's precision, a waterfall that split in two, a ridge that looked like a sleeping giant, a single lightning-scarred pine on a high pass. And 3 valleys to the east, deeper and higher into the mountain wilderness, was a single, deliberate X. Beside it, in the same careful hand, was a drawing of another cabin, this one seemingly nestled against a sheer cliff face. There were no words, no explanation, just the trail and the destination. For 2 days, Harriet hesitated. The journey looked perilous. The map showed a route that crossed high, exposed ridges, and descended into steep, unknown canyons. Winter was coming. The nights were already sharp with frost. To leave the meager safety of her repaired cabin and venture deeper into the wilderness felt like madness. It could be a wild goose chase, a joke played by a dead man. Silas Croft's mocking voice echoed in her mind. That mountain eats people like you. But the map felt like a promise. Alistair Finch, the trapper, had not been a fool. The careful construction of the first cabin, the clever hiding place, the beautifully rendered map, it all spoke of a deliberate, thoughtful mind. This was not a whim. It was an invitation. She decided to trust the man she had never met. She packed enough supplies for a week, loaded the patient Jed, and with the deerskin map tucked safely inside her coat, she left her small, hard-won home and followed the ghost's trail. The journey was a test of everything she had. The landmarks on the map were real, but finding them required a constant, wearying attention to the landscape. The lightning-scarred pine was her guide across a wind-blasted pass, where the air was so thin it hurt to breathe. The sleeping giant ridge forced her to lead Jed along a narrow ledge with a 1,000-foot drop just inches away. The mule never faltered, placing his hooves with an innate, stubborn wisdom that gave her courage. On the 5th day, exhausted and bone-weary, she found the second cabin. It was exactly where the map had indicated, tucked into an alcove at the base of a massive granite cliff, almost invisible until you were right upon it. This one was in far better condition. The door was solid oak, the windows had oiled paper panes, and the roof was sound. Inside, it was spare but immaculate. A bed with a folded wool blanket, a small stove, a single chair and table. It was as if the owner had simply walked out for the afternoon. And there, laid squarely in the center of the table, was another map. This one was drawn on a large piece of canvas, weighted down at the corners with smooth river stones. It was even more detailed than the first. It showed the path she had just taken, and then continued on, pushing even deeper into a region of sharp, unforgiving peaks labeled simply the Gorge. A new X marked a spot on the edge of a deep canyon, a place that, according to the territorial maps she had seen, was a blank, unexplored space. This was no longer just a journey. It was a pilgrimage. She was following the footsteps of a man who had made this wilderness his cathedral. She rested for only one night before pressing on, a sense of urgency now pulling at her, a feeling that she was getting closer to the heart of the mystery. The final leg of the journey was the most difficult of all, a descent into the gorge that was more a controlled fall than a hike. But Alistair Finch's map was a perfect guide. It led her to the one negotiable path, a switchback trail hidden by a screen of ancient firs. At the bottom of the gorge, beside a roaring river, hidden in a grove of aspen whose leaves had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold, she found it. The third cabin. It was not a cabin. It was a home. It was built of massive, hand-hewn logs, fitted together with a shipwright's precision. A stone porch faced the rising sun, and a plume of smoke, impossibly, curled from its chimney. Harriet froze, her hand on Jed's neck. Was someone here? She approached with caution, her heart pounding. The smoke, she soon realized, was not from a fire, but was steam rising from a natural hot spring that had been cleverly piped into a stone-lined bathing pool behind the cabin. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was cool and dry, smelling of cedar, beeswax, and old paper. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth clean and ready. The room was filled with the evidence of a life lived with purpose and craft. Shelves lined the walls, holding not just tins of food and supplies, but books, poetry, philosophy, geology, botany. A sturdy workbench stood in one corner, covered with finely made tools for surveying and map-making, and in the center of the room, on a massive table made from a single slab of pine, sat a thick, leather-bound ledger, easily 3 inches thick. It was closed, waiting. With a sense of reverence, Harriet ran her hand over the worn leather cover. This was it. This was the heart of the mystery. She opened it. The pages were not filled with words, but with maps, dozens upon dozens of them, executed with the breathtaking skill of a master cartographer. Alistair Finch had not just been a trapper, he had been a geographer, a scientist of the wilderness. For 20 years, he had systematically and secretly mapped the entire Sawtooth Range. His notes in the margins detailed water tables, timber quality, soil composition, and, most importantly, the precise location of mineral veins he had discovered. It was the life's work of a genius, a complete and perfect survey of a vast, uncharted territory. Tucked into a sleeve in the back cover of the ledger was a small, heavy tin box. Harriet opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of raw wool, was a doeskin pouch. She untied it and poured the contents onto the table. A river of gold dust and small, heavy nuggets cascaded out, gleaming in the soft light filtering through the window. It was a fortune, panned patiently over 2 decades from the mountain streams. Beneath the gold was one final folded letter. Her hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was the same as the notes on the maps, elegant and precise. To the one who arrives, it began. If you are reading this, you have proven yourself possessed of the one quality I have come to value above all others: patience. You have not sought to conquer this land, but to listen to it. I have no heir of my blood, so I leave my work and my wealth to the one with the wit to follow my trail. The gold is yours, to provide a beginning. But the maps are the true treasure. They show what is, not what men in faraway offices have guessed to be. The boundary of this territory is wrong. The line is drawn a full 10 miles west of where it should be. The valley of this cabin, and all the timber and grazing land to the east of it, legally belongs to no one. It is waiting for the one with the knowledge to claim it. Use this work wisely. Do not let the greedy ones have it. This land does not wish to be owned, only to be stewarded. Alistair Finch. Harriet sank into the chair, the letter trembling in her hand. She looked from the gold to the ledger full of maps. She was no longer a dismissed servant. She was the heir to a hidden kingdom. Her discovery was so immense, so world-altering, that she spent the first few days in a daze, simply exploring the cabin and its surroundings, trying to comprehend the scale of Alistair Finch's legacy. She read his journals, which were separate from the survey ledger. He was a man who had fled the noise and greed of the world to find solace and truth in the high mountains. He wrote of the geology with a poet's soul, of the changing seasons with a philosopher's insight. Harriet felt she knew him, this quiet, brilliant man who had trusted the mountains more than people. She felt a profound sense of responsibility to honor his wishes. This valley was not just a claim to be filed, it was a sanctuary to be protected. She had found her purpose, but the mountains had one final test for her. The weather, which had been clear and cold, turned. The sky grew heavy and gray, the color of lead. A strange silence fell over the gorge, the birdsong ceasing, the wind dying down to an expectant hush. Then, the snow began. It started as gentle flakes, but within an hour it had become a blinding, furious blizzard. The wind howled through the canyon, a physical force that shook the sturdy cabin. Drifts began to pile up against the walls, quickly burying the windows on the north side. Harriet had never seen such a storm. She brought Jed into a small, attached lean-to that served as a woodshed, ensuring he was sheltered and had hay from the trapper's ample stores. For 3 days, the world outside vanished into a churning vortex of white. She was completely isolated, trapped in her newfound inheritance. She kept the fire roaring, cooked Finch's preserved food, and spent her time poring over the maps, memorizing the landscape he had so lovingly charted. The storm was terrifying, but the cabin was a fortress. Finch had built it to withstand the worst the mountains could offer. On the 4th day, the wind lessened slightly. Through a patch she had cleared on a window, Harriet was staring into the swirling snow when she saw movement. A dark shape, stumbling, struggling through the deep drifts. It was a man. He was barely on his feet, collapsing every few steps, his progress agonizingly slow. He was covered in snow, his face obscured, but she could see he was at the end of his strength. Without a second thought for her own safety, she pulled on Finch's heavy winter coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and plunged out into the storm, a rope in her hand. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. The snow was waist-deep. She fought her way toward the fallen figure, shouting into the wind. He was nearly buried when she reached him, unconscious, his face pale and his lips blue. He was a prospector, judging by the pickaxe still clutched in his frozen hand. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to get the rope around his chest and began the brutal task of dragging him back to the cabin. It took her the better part of an hour, every muscle screaming in protest. Inside, she stripped off his frozen clothes and wrapped him in warm blankets near the fire. He was gaunt, his hands and feet showing the telltale white of severe frostbite. For the next 2 days, as the blizzard raged outside, she nursed him. She thawed his frozen limbs in lukewarm water, a painful, delicate process. She spoon-fed him warm broth made from dried venison she found in the larder. He was delirious, muttering about a lost claim and a partner who had left him. She sat by his side, keeping the fire high, her commitment to this place and its legacy solidifying with every act of care. She was using Alistair Finch's provisions to save a life. She was becoming the steward he had hoped for. When the storm finally broke, the world was transformed. Everything was covered in a thick, pristine blanket of white, the sky a piercing, brilliant blue. The prospector, whose name was Elias, was weak but lucid. He looked around the cabin with wide, disbelieving eyes, and then at Harriet. His gaze filled with a profound, humbled gratitude. You saved my life, miss," he stammered. "I thought I was a dead man for sure." He told her his story, how he and his partner had been caught in the storm, how they'd gotten separated, how he'd stumbled blindly for days before collapsing. Harriet simply nodded, offering him more broth. She didn't speak of the maps or the gold. It wasn't the time. When Elias was strong enough to travel, they prepared to leave. The journey out of the gorge was slow and difficult in the deep snow, but together they managed it, with Jed breaking trail like a seasoned plow. As they traveled back towards the town of Ketchum, a journey that took more than a week, a quiet friendship formed between them. Elias was a simple, honest man, and he was in awe of Harriet's capability and her quiet strength. When they finally rode into the main street, looking ragged and weathered, the townspeople stared. Silas Croft was standing on the porch of the land office and his jaw dropped. He had clearly presumed her dead, a foolish girl swallowed by the wilderness. Elias, before seeking out the doctor, stood beside Harriet and told his story to the gathered crowd. He spoke in a loud, clear voice, leaving no doubt as to what had happened. "This woman," he declared, pointing at Harriet, "found me half dead in the worst blizzard I've ever seen. She took me in, tended to my frostbite, and saved my life. She's got more grit and sense than any 10 men in this town." A murmur went through the crowd. They looked at Harriet differently now, not with pity or scorn, but with a new, grudging respect. Croft's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. His narrative of her foolishness had just been publicly dismantled. Harriet, ignoring the stares, walked directly into the land office, the heavy leather ledger under her arm. Mr. Ames, the clerk, looked up, his eyes wide. "Miss Lowe, we thought you were—" "I need to file a claim," she said, her voice steady. "And I need to see the territorial surveyor?" She heaved the ledger onto the counter. It landed with a solid, authoritative thud that echoed in the silent room. Croft pushed his way forward. "What is this nonsense? Some trapper's diary?" He reached for it, but Harriet placed her hand flat on the cover. "This," she said, looking him directly in the eye, "is the truth." The territorial surveyor, a quiet, meticulous man named Mr. Davies, was summoned from his office down the street. He was skeptical at first, but as he opened the ledger and began to examine Alistair Finch's work, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to utter astonishment. For a full week, he sequestered himself with the ledger, comparing its pages to the official government surveys. The town buzzed with speculation. Finally, Davies emerged, looking pale and deeply impressed. He called a public meeting at the land office. The room was packed. "For 20 years, Davies began, his voice filled with reverence, a man named Alistair Finch, living in seclusion, conducted the most thorough and accurate survey of the Sawtooth Range ever undertaken." He held up one of Finch's maps. "His work proves, beyond any doubt, that the original territorial boundary survey of 1863 was flawed. The line is wrong." He unrolled the official map and used a charcoal pencil to draw a new line, a line that seeded a massive triangle of land, thousands of acres of prime timber and rich river valleys from federal jurisdiction. "According to the law," Davies concluded, his voice ringing with authority, "this land is unclaimed, untitled, and open to the first legal filing." A collective gasp went through the room. Silas Croft looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Harriet Lowe, using the gold Finch had left her, had already filed, her claim covering the hidden valley of the third cabin and the headwaters of the river. The fool girl had inherited a kingdom. The final scene unfolds 6 months later in the warm, slanting light of a late summer evening. The valley of the third cabin, now known simply as Finch Valley, is peaceful. Harriet Lowe stands on the stone porch of her home, looking out at the land she now stewards. The air is sweet with the smell of cut hay and pine. Below, in the lush meadow, Jed the mule grazes contentedly, his days of hard travel over. The valley is no longer empty, but it is not crowded. Elias, the prospector she saved, has become her foreman and loyal friend. He proved to be a man of his word, and his gratitude has transformed into a fierce, protective loyalty. He manages the small, sustainable timber operation she has established on the far side of the valley, using Finch's maps to select only fallen or aging trees, preserving the old-growth forest. A handful of other families have settled in the lower valley, families Harriet invited herself, people she knew to be hard-working, honest, and respectful of the land. They are building a community, not a boomtown. There is a one-room schoolhouse under construction and the beginnings of a grist mill on the river. The town of Ketchum now regards Finch Valley with a kind of mythic awe. Traders make the journey to buy their well-milled lumber and to gaze at the woman who outsmarted the mountains. Silas Croft, his reputation shattered and his speculative ventures souring, had left the territory in disgrace. Mr. Davies, the surveyor, is visiting. He stands beside Harriet on the porch, holding a newly printed official map of the territory. It shows the corrected boundary line, and within the new lands, the neatly drawn square of the Lowe claim. He is still marveling at Finch's work. "He was a remarkable man," Davies says quietly, "to have done all this alone with such precision." He looks at Harriet, People are calling you the queen of the sawtooths, you know. Harriet smiles, a small, private expression. She shakes her head. They have it wrong. Davies looks puzzled. What will you call this place, officially? Finch Valley is what the people say, but the deed needs a name. Harriet looks out at the vast, silent peaks turning gold and amber in the setting sun. She thinks of the dismissed servant girl who arrived with nothing, of the mocking laughter, of the old woman's cryptic words. She thinks of Alastair Finch's patient, brilliant solitude. She found more than land and gold. She had found a sense of belonging that was rooted in the earth itself. I didn't build this, she says, her voice quiet but clear, carrying the entire weight of her journey. I just found my way home. Thank you for staying with us for this incredible story of resilience and hidden worth. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not by those who seek to conquer, but by those who have the patience to listen. If you were moved by Harriet's journey, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a story about the quiet power of patience. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next tale from the annals of forgotten history. Until then, take care.